The boy landed on a Tuesday. Nobody knew it was Tuesday, of course. The planet had no calendar, no week, no concept of a day divided into anything smaller than alive and not alive. But Cale Morrow, who was 7 years old and had just watched his parents' escape pod streak away through a burning orange sky, decided in that first terrible hour that he would keep counting. He carved a mark in the bark of the nearest dead tree with his thumbnail. 1. He did not cry. He had already cried on the pod, while his mother pressed her forehead against his and told him the other pod would be right behind, that they would find each other on the surface, that everything was going to be fine. He had believed her completely. Children that age believe everything their mothers say, even things that are demonstrably impossible, even things that the burning wreckage overhead was already proving false. He sat beside the dead tree for a long time after the sky went quiet. The planet was called Veldara 9 in the Galactic Consolidate's official registry, filed under Category 7, uninhabitable, extreme fauna risk, no settlement permitted. The Consolidate survey team that had catalogued it 26 years prior had spent 11 days on the surface before departing, 3 of them evacuating a colleague whose arm had been removed above the elbow by something the team's biologist described, in her report, as a coordinated ambush by creatures we have designated CR7, common name, ridge stalkers, displaying pack intelligence levels inconsistent with known evolutionary models. The report had recommended that the planet be flagged for study at extreme distance only. It had been filed, cross-indexed, and forgotten. The Morrow family had not read the survey report. They had been fleeing, which is the kind of situation that does not leave time for library research. Their ship, a mid-class civilian hauler registered to Cale's father, David, had taken a debris strike from a Consolidate patrol engagement near the Ulrich corridor, and the subsequent drive failure had left them tumbling toward the nearest gravity well, which happened to be Veldara 9. David had managed 2 pods. He had managed to get his wife and youngest child into one and his son into the other. He had not managed to get himself into either. Cale had not watched his father's section of the ship. He had watched the other pod. He had watched it long enough to see the trajectory was wrong, angled too steep, burning too fast, and then he had watched something else because sometimes the only way to survive a thing is to stop looking at it. The ridge stalkers found him 3 hours after he landed. He ran. He ran the way 7-year-olds run when they are very frightened and very small, and the things chasing them are 4-legged and fast, and make a sound like iron grinding on iron when they call to each other. He ran until he fell into a river he had not seen, a narrow rushing torrent that cut through a canyon so deep it was almost night at the bottom, and the ridge stalkers did not follow him into the water. He discovered, gasping on the far bank, that ridge stalkers did not swim. The first lesson of Veldara 9, water was a wall. He spent the next 6 months near water. He ate what he could reach from the bank's flat gray plants that tasted like chalk, and left a numbness on his tongue that faded after an hour. Small pale things that lived under flat rocks, a kind of root that, when he bit into it the first time, made his vision go strange and bright for 4 terrifying hours before settling into an ordinary evening. He learned which ones were safe by eating very small amounts and waiting. He learned quickly. Hunger was an exceptional teacher. Hunger did not give partial credit. Hunger did not grade on a curve. He marked the dead tree. He kept counting. There was a period, weeks 2 through 8 roughly, where he talked to himself constantly. Full conversations, aloud, the sound of his own voice, something he needed in a way that went beyond comfort into something closer to proof. He narrated what he was doing. I am eating the gray plant. I am moving upstream. I am looking for the place where the rock overhangs the water because that is where smaller things hide and smaller things are easier to catch than larger things. The narration kept 2 things running in parallel: the practical computation of survival and the reassurance that he was still a person who could narrate, that there was still a self doing the narrating. He did not examine this too closely. It worked, and on Veldara 9, anything that worked was correct. He stopped talking aloud by month 3. The silence had become less threatening. The world's sounds had become more legible. He could hear the difference between the river in ordinary flow and the river when something had disturbed it upstream. He could hear the wind moving through the canyon walls at a pitch that meant open air above, and a different pitch that meant rock close on both sides. He was still narrating, but internally now, and the internal narration felt like less of a lifeline and more like tool use. By the time he had 341 marks, he had stopped looking like a 7-year-old and started looking like something else. He was taller. His hands were different, wider, harder at the palms, the fingers calloused in patterns that would have puzzled a doctor who had only ever seen children's hands. He had stopped crying at night, not because he felt better, but because crying used water and water needed to be managed. He did not think about his mother. He thought about her the way you think about air constantly, without ever saying so, without letting it become a thing you examine because you knew, without knowing how you knew, that examining it would kill you. He thought about his father occasionally. When he did, he carved another mark. The ridge stalkers came back in his 2nd year. They came back because he had started moving away from the rivers. He had eaten everything near the water that could be safely eaten, had mapped the canyon walls in his head until he could navigate them in darkness, and the interior of the continent smelled of something he could only describe as food. He had grown enough and moved enough that his scent profile had changed. He smelled less like a human child, which smelled to Veldaran fauna like nothing much at all, and more like whatever he was becoming, which smelled like something that lived in their territory. 2 ridge stalkers came over a ridge at dusk and stopped when they saw him. He stopped when he saw them. He had spent 2 years learning what made them go away, and so he knew, without having to think about it very hard, that running was wrong, that making himself small was wrong, that the sounds a human throat produced at frequencies near 800 Hz made them agitated. He knew that their eyes tracked movement before they tracked mass. He knew that they settled disputes between themselves with a specific posture, weight shifted to the hindquarters, neck lowered, eyes flat, that seemed to function as a kind of acknowledgement. I have seen you. I am not deciding yet. He shifted his weight to his heels. He dropped his chin. He held his eyes level. The lead ridge stalker stared at him for 11 seconds. Then it did the same thing back. Something passed between them. He didn't have a word for it, would not have a word for it for years, would eventually settle on recognition, not friendliness, not trust, not anything so warm as those, but the cold acknowledgement of one territorial intelligence to another. You are a thing that is here. I have logged you. I am continuing. They stepped around him and went down the slope. He stood there until his legs stopped shaking. Then he found a flat rock, sat on it, and stayed still for a very long time. He was thinking about something his father had told him once, on a trading run to the outer Parvan systems, watching Kale lose badly at a card game against a Heathran spacer twice his height. His father had leaned close and said, quietly, "The game is never what they say it is. You have to learn the actual game before you can play it." Veldara 9 had an actual game. It was not survival. Every creature on the planet was surviving. The ridge stalkers survived, the canyon crawlers survived, the vast slow things that moved through the high grass survived. Survival was just being present for the next hour. The actual game was something else. The actual game was position. Who belongs here? Who has standing? Who is recognized as a thing that takes up space in the world's accounting? He had just won a round. By his 4th year, he had worked out a rough taxonomy of the major predator species in the lowland regions. There were 7 that he had cataloged with enough regularity to assign patterns. Ridge stalkers, whom he had learned to communicate with in a crude and mostly spatial language of posture and weight and eye line. Canyon crawlers, which were solitary and territorial, and which he had learned to avoid by smell. They exuded a sulfuric compound when they were hunting that carried far enough to give him 10 minutes of warning. The grass runners, which were small and fast and technically not predators, but which the ridge stalkers hunted, meaning they moved in relationship to the stalkers in predictable ways he could read like text. The scaled pale things that came up from the deep sinkholes at night, which he had no strategy for yet and was still working on. He thought about this the way other children his age, wherever they were, whoever they were now, thought about math problems, methodically, with revision, with the understanding that a wrong answer on Veldara 9 was not a mark in red ink but something considerably more permanent. By his 5th year he had developed a theory, crude, untestable, built entirely from observation, about why the apex predators of Veldara 9 were as intelligent as they were. The planet had almost no middle-tier fauna. Nothing in the weight class between 40 and 400 kilograms lived here for long without being exceptional, which meant every ecological pressure had been resolved toward the extremes, very small and fast and invisible, or very large and intelligent and social. The ridge stalkers occupied the intelligent social tier, and they occupied it the way a landlord occupies a building, with a total, unreflective assumption of authority. They had no natural predators. They had no challenges except each other and the resource constraints of the terrain. What they had not, in any of the recorded prior encounters with Consolidate survey teams, ever dealt with was something that was persistently not prey and persistently not competition. They had frameworks for prey behavior and frameworks for territorial challenger behavior. They had, apparently, no framework for a small, slow, physically unimpressive creature that refused to act like either. He had become, in the taxonomy of their experience, an unknown category. And unknown categories, he had come to understand, were not automatically hostile territory. They were gaps, and gaps in any system of categories were places where new things could happen. He was 11 years old. His hair was long and he had cut it himself with a fragment of shale. He had stopped counting marks because, at some point, counting had stopped helping. He knew what he was doing with his time, and he no longer needed to prove it. He did not think about rescue. That had been a habit in year 1, year 2, into year 3, the sky watching, the elevated positions he climbed to when weather permitted, the way his eyes went up every time something bright crossed overhead. He had stopped. Not because he had given up exactly, but because that particular attention was expensive and bought him nothing. The boy who kept his eyes on the sky was the boy who didn't see what was moving in the grass. He watched the grass. In his 7th year, he found the wreck. He had been following a canyon system northwest for 3 weeks, drawn by the smell of the scrub growth that the canyon crawlers seemed to avoid, which meant, by his working logic, that something in the soil discouraged their sulfuric marking, which meant soil chemistry different from the lowland, which might mean different edibles. He had gotten very good at following chains of inference. On Veldara 9, a broken chain killed you. An intact chain was the difference between a good month and a bad one. The wreck was half buried in a slope collapse at the canyon's head. Military configuration, long chassis, drive array, multiple crew compartments. Galactic Consolidate markings still visible under the growth that had crawled over everything. The crash looked old. Decades, maybe. Whatever crew had been aboard was long gone one way or another. The ship's structural damage was catastrophic. No power, no systems, nothing to plug into and query. But it had cargo bays. He spent 4 days going through the cargo bays. He found 3 undamaged survival suits in vacuum-rated plastic cases, 2 energy cells that were flat dead, 7 ration packs that his body no longer wanted to eat, a medical kit with 17 of its original 22 items still present, a handheld survey scanner that had survived in a sealed equipment locker, and after he cleaned the contacts and left it in direct sunlight for a full day, powered on. He sat with the scanner in his lap and looked at it for a long time. The scanner had a limited database, survey-grade geological focus, not much in the way of biological data, but it had a communication function, a short-range locator beacon that would ping on consolidate frequencies if anything was listening within 400,000 kilometers. He turned it over in his hands. He thought about turning the beacon on. He also found, in a sealed compartment in the forward section that had taken him a full day to cut open with tools he made from the ship's own structural material, a set of personal effects that had survived in an airtight locker. Someone's effects, a crew member, gender indeterminate from what remained but human. A photograph, faded but visible, 2 adults, 3 children, standing somewhere with green grass and a building in the background. The kind of image you brought with you when you went somewhere you couldn't be sure of coming back from. He held the photograph for a long time. He had not looked at a human face that was not his own reflection in 3 years. The faces in the photograph were soft, pre-exposure, the faces of people who lived somewhere with green grass and buildings. He felt something complex looking at them, not recognition exactly, not grief exactly, something in the register between them. The people in the photograph had brought it because they needed to carry something of home. He had no photograph. He had no physical evidence of anywhere else. He had only the marks in the bark, which he had stopped making, and the cargo of whatever he was carrying internally, which was growing heavier and lighter at the same time in ways he could not fully account for. He put the photograph back in the locker. He left it there. It seemed important not to keep it, not because it was painful to look at, but because the people in it were not his, and keeping it would be a kind of reaching for a connection he was not entitled to. He went back to the scanner. He thought about turning the beacon on. Then he turned it off, replaced it in the locker, and went back to his camp. He needed to think about who would come. He needed to think about what it would mean for them to find him. He had spent 7 years becoming something that Veldara 9 would tolerate, that it would, in its way, accept. He had position here. He had the actual game. What he did not know was whether the people who came in response to that beacon would understand any of that, or whether they would see a feral child and do what the Consolidate always did with things it classified, which was contain them. He needed to be ready before he called anyone. He spent the next 3 years getting ready. Part of getting ready was practical. He expanded his territorial range methodically, mapping in the scanner everything he had previously kept in his head, building a database that was, he knew, more detailed than anything the Consolidate had on this world. He documented the Ridge Stalker communication system with the same care he would have brought to a language study, developing a notation system for posture configurations and vocalization frequencies, and the context dependencies that changed what a given signal meant. He documented the canyon crawler chemistry with enough precision that someone with access to a laboratory could synthesize the repellent compound. He documented the sinkhole network using the scanner's ground-penetrating function, tracing the underground water channels and the geological formations that explained why the plateau held moisture through the dry season when the plains didn't. Part of getting ready was harder. He had not thought about his parents in a systematic way for years. He had managed the grief, if grief was what it was. He had never been fully certain whether grief was the right category for something that had never resolved enough to mourn by declining to examine it directly. He knew it was there. He navigated around it the same way he navigated around the canyon crawler dens, with awareness of location and consistent, respectful distance. He did not go in. But whoever came in response to that beacon was going to ask about it. They were going to have faces trained to receive difficult information, and they were going to ask him what had happened and how he felt about it, and they were going to have frameworks. He was increasingly certain of this. Frameworks for what a child who had experienced this kind of loss was supposed to look like. And he was going to have to explain that he had organized it differently than the framework expected. Practiced alone. He said the words out loud. He said, "My father did not make it to either pod," he said. "I believe my mother's pod was lost on entry." He said these things in the same voice he used for everything, the flat, unhurried voice that had no performance in it, and he sat with how they felt, and what he found was that they felt like stones he had been carrying so long he had forgotten the weight until he shifted them and felt the absence. Not heavier when named. Lighter. Not resolved. Lighter. He allowed himself to think about his mother's forehead against his, and what she had said, and that he had believed her completely. He allowed himself to think about it until he could carry it without putting it down, and then he sealed it again carefully, not because he was hiding it, but because it was his. 3 years, then he turned the beacon on. In his 8th year on the planet, he made his first real alliance. He had been tracking a pack of ridge stalkers for 2 months, not to hunt them. Hunting ridge stalkers was something he had tried once in his 4th year, when he was hungry enough to be stupid, and the experience had left him with a scar on his left shoulder and a much clearer understanding of the word ambush. He had been tracking them to understand their range and their pack hierarchy, which had shifted since the previous season. A new alpha, larger than the predecessor, a ridge stalker he had been tracking for 3 years and had privately named Case, had emerged from a territory dispute with a neighboring pack, and the new alpha's decision-making was different, more risk-tolerant. The pack was ranging farther, which meant their range was beginning to overlap with his. He needed them to know where the line was. He needed them to have a relationship with the line that was about acknowledgement rather than enforcement, because enforcement, confrontation, was a game he would never fully win against 12 apex predators, no matter what he had learned. He found a way in through the periphery of the pack's social structure. There were 2 juveniles, both in that period where the young of any social species are curious before they are territorial. He spent 6 weeks approaching them in conditions of non-threat, downwind, low posture, slow movement, near food sources where they were distracted. He let them get used to him. He did not try to communicate in the posture language he used with adults. Juveniles had different social rules. He sat near them and did things. Ate slowly, moving with deliberate repetition. Made tools, he was always making tools, napping edges, splitting material, shaping, and let them watch. Let their curiosity work without feeding it directly. By the end of 6 weeks, one of the juveniles had taken a piece of his discarded work material and carried it away. He watched it go and felt something he could not quite name, close to what his father had looked like watching him finally beat the Heathran spacer at cards. Not pride, something quieter, recognition of a system working. The alpha noticed him at the territory boundary 3 weeks later. They held the posture exchange. What happened next was different from any exchange before. The alpha broke the pattern, not aggressively, but with a specific motion he had seen pack members make to each other. A slow turn of the head, not looking away from him, looking across him, the way you might look across a landscape you have incorporated into your mental map. He was in the map. Over the following year, the relationship developed in ways he had not fully anticipated and could not have planned. The pack did not hunt near his primary camp. He did not follow them into their denning area. When their ranges coincided, they moved with a loose and mutual awareness that he would have described, if he had anyone to describe it to, as professional courtesy. He brought nothing to it that any of them needed. He could not keep up with them in a hunt, could not contribute to their social disputes, could not offer anything the pack didn't already have. What he had was presence. What he had was the acknowledgement, given and received, that he was a thing with standing. He understood something that year about what humans were. Not the thing the Galactic Consolidate said they were: Category 3 sapient species, moderate technology index, political classification, unaligned. Not the thing the Heathran and the Dravari and the other old species said they were: newcomers, provisional, potentially interesting, but ultimately limited in the way that all species without the fourth-dimensional perception were limited, always reacting to the present moment, never able to see the full shape of time. What humans were, on Veldara 9, in the 9th year of Kale Morrow's presence on the surface, was something else. Humans were the species that made maps when they had no maps. That built relationships with things that had no reason to have relationships. That kept counting even when counting had stopped mattering. That looked at a world designed to end them and said, with a stubbornness that was not heroism and not philosophy, but just the basic cellular refusal to be a thing that had happened and stopped, no. Not yet. What else? In his 10th year, the Consolidate came. They arrived in a standard survey configuration, 1 capital ship, 2 support vessels, a shuttle complement. He had turned the beacon on 4 months prior, after what he thought of as a long time making up his mind. He had spent those 4 months arranging things so that whoever came would arrive into a situation, not a rescue. He had moved through the territories of 3 major predator groups and established what he could only call relationship with each. He had mapped the canyon systems and the water table and the sinkhole distribution in a 50-kilometer radius. He had learned things about Veldara 9's soil chemistry, geology, and atmospheric patterns that the original survey team had missed because they had spent 11 days and left. He watched the shuttle descend from high ground. He watched it from between 2 ridge stalkers who were also watching it, because the altitude he had chosen was in their range, and he had given them adequate time to get used to his presence there. The Consolidate shuttle was making a lot of noise. The ridge stalkers did not like the noise. He made a low, sustained sound in his chest. He had developed a range of vocalizations over the years, shaped partly by observation of the animals around him, and partly by whatever human thing in him had needed to keep producing language even with no one to receive it. The ridge stalkers relaxed marginally. He kept making the sound. The shuttle landed in the flat basin below. 12 soldiers exited, full armor, weapons out. Standard Consolidate deployment for a potentially hazardous retrieval. 2 medics in lighter gear. A civilian woman in a gray survey coat, holding a scanner, looking at the ground around the shuttle with the focused attention of someone cataloging. He watched them for 2 hours. They searched in expanding circles, standard grid. The civilian kept stopping to scan and make notes. The soldiers kept their weapons elevated and moved with the sharp, over-alert body language of people who had read the survey report and found the fauna assessment alarming. He had been watching them long enough to know something was going wrong with their sweep pattern. They were avoiding the east quadrant, which probably meant the canyon crawler that denned in the rock shelf on the east canyon face had already made itself known. One of the soldiers had a different kind of tension in his shoulders than the others. Not threat response, something else. After 2 hours, he stood up. The ridge stalkers flanked him. They were not following him. They were moving along their own established route, which happened to parallel his descent. He did not pretend this made them his. It didn't. But from below, moving toward the base of the slope, he knew what it looked like. The soldiers saw him first. He could track the cascade. One of them at the perimeter went still, then the rest stilled, weapons coming up, and then there was a pause that lasted long enough to tell him they were confused by what they were seeing. He kept walking at the same pace, the same unhurried, wait-forward stride he had developed on Veldara 9, which ate ground differently from how people walked on ships and stations. He was 17 years old. He was wearing a combination of the survival suit material and what he had made himself. His hair was cut short. His face was level. Behind him, the ridge stalkers crested the slope and moved along the ridge in their own unhurried way, iron-on-iron calls passing between them. The civilian in the gray coat reached him first, having pushed through the soldiers without appearing to notice their weapons were out. She was approximately 60, brown face, close-cropped gray hair, a scanner in one hand and the expression of someone who had just been presented with data she had not expected and found it the most interesting thing she had seen in years. "You're the Morrow child," she said, "not a question." "I'm Cale Morrow," he said. His voice sounded strange to him. He had kept his voice by talking to himself, but talking to himself was different from talking to someone who would answer. How long has it been? Since the crash. 10 years and 4 months, she said. We got your beacon 4 months ago. It took time to certify the retrieval and allocate resources. She looked at the ridge above him without looking away from him, the practiced assessment of someone used to watching two things at once. Are those animals following you? No, he said. They're on their route. I happen to be going the same direction. She looked at him for a moment. Are you injured? No. Are you? She stopped. Whatever she had been about to ask, she reconsidered it. My name is Dr. Senavath. I'm a xenobiologist. I was aboard because the Consolidate doesn't normally send a survey team with a retrieval, but I put in a request when I heard about the signal location. I've been studying Veldara 9 from orbital data for 6 years. She paused. I'd like to ask you some questions if you're willing. I'll answer what I can, he said. I want to ask some questions too. About what? About what happens next, he said. About where I go. About what the Consolidate intends to do with the survey data and whether there are extraction permits in discussion, and what the classification status of the planet is going to be. Dr. Vath looked at him for a long, careful moment. You've been here 10 years, she said. Yes. You're 17. Yes. And your first question is about extraction permits. The canyon systems in the northeast quadrant have a mineral signature consistent with high-grade tetralium ore, he said. The Consolidate has been running extraction operations in the Ulrich Corridor region for the last decade. The debris that hit our ship was from one of those operations, based on the fragment profile I analyzed from what came through the hull. He kept his voice even, not accusatory, factual. I want to know what the Consolidate plans to do with this planet before I tell them anything useful about it. The silence stretched. One of the soldiers had lowered his weapon. Then, after a moment, a second one. Dr. Vath put her scanner in her pocket and said, in a voice that had shed its clinical detachment like an outer coat, I think you should come and sit with us, and we're going to have a much longer conversation than the Consolidate authorized. I think so too, Kale said. He sat with her beside the shuttle as the afternoon moved. He told her things. He told her about the canyon crawler's denning patterns, and the fact that the east quadrant would be better approached from the water channel 300 meters north. He told her about the Ridge Stalker pack hierarchy and the territorial language, and the 3 years of relationship building that had produced the current arrangement. He told her about the soil chemistry, the nitrogen-fixing microorganisms he had identified in the scrub growth, the sinkhole distribution, and what it suggested about the underground water system. He told her about the things he had not yet worked out, the scaled things from the deep sinkholes, the atmospheric event that happened twice a year that killed small fauna in the southern lowlands. He told her everything systematically, in the order of what she would need most if she was staying. She took notes without stopping. She asked sharp, precise questions that told him she knew what she was doing. Once, when he described a particular adaptation of the Ridge Stalker's night vision, she stopped writing and looked at him. You worked this out by observation, she said. I didn't have instruments until I found the survey wreck, he said. Year 7. Before that it was observation and inference. Over 10 years. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The Consolidate is going to classify you, she said finally, and the way she said it he understood she was warning him. I know, he said. What category? Survivor, possibly trauma case. There's a protocol for children lost in dangerous environments. They're going to want to assess you. Assess what? Whether you're, she stopped again, started again. The standard assumption is that extended isolation in a hostile environment produces psychological damage. They have a framework for it. And if I don't fit the framework? She looked at him for a long moment. That's what I'm worried about. The capital ship's commander, a lean Consolidate officer named Verk Dahl, came down in the second shuttle that evening. He was efficient, polite, and clearly following a procedure that had been written for a different situation. He spoke to Kale with the particular careful tone of someone who expected to be managing psychological fragility and was already recalculating because the person in front of him was not fragile, not in any way he had instruments for. "You'll want to come aboard," Dahl said. "We can arrange medical evaluation, reintegration support." "I'll come aboard," Kale said. "I want to discuss terms first." Dahl blinked. "Terms?" "The planet, its status. I've been here 10 years. I know it better than your survey database. That knowledge is useful to the Consolidate. I'm willing to share it." "I want something in exchange." "You're a 17-year-old human." "I'm the person who spent a decade developing a working relationship with the primary apex predator population on a Category 7 world," Kale said. "I'm the person who can tell your extraction teams how to operate here without losing personnel, if extraction is what the Consolidate is planning. I'm the person who knows where the water is and what's in the soil, and why the Northeast Canyon system has a mineral signature that should interest you." He held Dahl's gaze. His voice was the same flat, neutral voice he had used to establish himself with the Ridge Stalkers. Not aggressive, not submissive, positioned. "What I want is a seat at the table when you decide what happens to this planet." The silence had a particular quality. He had heard silences like that before, on Veldara 9, in the moment before an animal recalculated its threat assessment. Dahl said, "I'll need to contact the regional office." "Take your time," Kale said. "I've been patient for 10 years. He went aboard that night. He slept in a bunk that was too soft and too quiet and entirely without the layered nocturnal soundscape of Veldara 9, and he lay awake for 3 hours processing the silence before his body finally decided it was safe enough. In the morning, Dr. Vath found him in the ship's observation deck, watching the planet below. "You should eat," she said. "The cooks are confused about what you'll accept." "I'll eat anything," he said. "That's not a metaphor." She sat next to him. They looked at the planet for a while. It was beautiful from here, vast and orange and brown, the canyon systems visible as dark lines from orbit, the high-altitude cloud formations that he knew meant the atmospheric event was building in the south. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The south weather pattern," he said. "It'll clear the lowlands in about 6 days. If the survey team wants to study the fauna die-off event, they need to be in position at the canyon mouth by day 4. She looked at him. "You're already planning our research schedule." "Someone has to," he said. And there was something in his voice then that had not been there in any of the conversations before, not calculation, not positioning, but something that felt, even to him, like something approaching humor. Like a door opening that had been shut for a long time. "Can I ask you something personal?" Dr. Vath said. "Yes." 10 years, a 7-year-old child dropped into, she made a small gesture. "How did you not?" She did not finish the sentence. He thought about how to answer this honestly. He thought about the river in year 1. He thought about the marks he had carved and stopped carving. He thought about the 11 seconds with the Ridge Stalker on the slope in his 2nd year, the cold transaction of mutual recognition that had been, in the logic of Veldara 9, more valuable than anything warmer. He thought about his father's voice. The game is never what they say it is. He thought about his mother's forehead against his. He was very careful not to think about that too long. "I kept moving," he said, "and I kept learning the actual game." "Which was?" "Position," he said, "standing, being a thing the world has to account for." He looked at the planet below them. "You can endure anything if it means something. The hard part isn't the danger. The danger is actually the easy part because the danger tells you what to do next. The hard part is—" He stopped. He found the word. "The hard part is the silence. The moments when there's nothing chasing you and there's nothing to solve and it's just you, and the question of who you are when there's nothing pressing against you." Dr. Vath did not say anything, She had stopped taking notes. I answered it the wrong way for a while, he said. I made myself smaller, quieter. I tried not to take up space. I thought that was how you survived. He paused. It isn't. The world doesn't make room for you because you're polite. It makes room for you because you take up space in a way it has to recognize. You push back not against things but into them. You press yourself into the world until it has to acknowledge that you're there. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of someone who had built things and fought things, and mapped things with no tools but themselves for a decade. They were not the hands he had arrived with. I missed my parents every day, he said. He said it quietly and he did not elaborate on it, but he said it, which was the first time he had said it out loud to anyone. It sat there between them like a stone placed carefully on a surface. I kept going anyway. Those two things were both true at the same time. She nodded. She seemed to understand that there was nothing useful to say to that, so she said nothing, which was the right call. Commander Dahl called him to a meeting that afternoon. 3 officers, a legal representative of the Consolidate Regional Office via encrypted link, and Dr. Vath, who had apparently been invited without Dahl's complete enthusiasm. The legal representative, a Heathran whose name he did not catch and who had the manner of someone conducting a proceeding they considered routine, explained the standard protocol: medical evaluation, psychological assessment, reintegration support, eventual transfer to the nearest human settlement hub. And the planet, Kale said. Category 7 classification will be maintained pending further review. I'd like to accelerate that review, Kale said. I have 10 years of observational data that your survey team doesn't have. I'd like to contribute it formally. You're a minor. I'm a person who has sustained independent survival on a Category 7 world for 10 years and 4 months, he said. If the Consolidate's legal framework defines that as a minor in need of protection rather than a resource in need of consultation, I'd suggest that's a problem with the framework. He kept his voice exactly the same way he had kept his body on the slope in year 2, weight back, eyes flat, not aggressive, positioned. I'm not asking for anything the Consolidate wouldn't give a certified xenologist. I'm asking to be consulted on decisions about a world I know more about than anyone currently in this system. The legal representative looked at Dahl. Dahl looked at Dr. Vath. Dr. Vath was looking at Kale with an expression he was coming to recognize. The expression of someone who had expected one thing and received another, and was recalibrating toward the more interesting possibility. I'll note the request formally, the legal representative said, in a voice that suggested this was less of a concession than a strategic delay. I'd appreciate that, Kale said. I'd also appreciate access to the ship's database so I can begin formally documenting my observations while my memory is current. He got the database access that evening. He also got, before the meeting broke up, something he had not expected. Commander Dahl remained at the table after the others filed out, and for a moment said nothing, just looked at him with an expression that was not official and not procedural. I read your documentation, Dahl said. The summary Dr. Vath compiled from your initial interview. Kale waited. I've been in the Consolidate for 22 years, Dahl said. I've deployed to 8 Category 6 and 7 worlds. I've never lost a crew member to a CR7 engagement. He paused. That's partly because I don't go where they are unless I have to. What you're describing, what you built on this surface, I don't have a category for it. The Consolidate has a lot of categories without the right entries, Kale said, not unkindly. Just factually. Dahl looked at him for another moment. The psychological report will recommend extended assessment, he said. I want you to know that I'm going to attach a note to it from command level supporting your request for consultancy status. That won't override the assessment requirement, but it will, he chose the word carefully. It will contextualize it. Kale studied the man's face. He had gotten very good over 10 years at reading intent in the posture and micro-movements of living creatures. Dahl was doing something that cost him something, procedure against something more immediate, and the more immediate thing was winning, just barely. It was, in the language of the Ridge Stalkers, an acknowledgement of an unknown category. "Thank you," Cale said. He meant it. He worked through the night, eating when Dr. Vath brought him food and not stopping otherwise. He worked in the methodical, revision-tolerant way he had learned to work, building from what he knew toward what he was inferring, marking the edges of his certainty clearly, leaving architecture in the document for what came next. He wrote about the Ridge Stalker communication system with the specificity of someone describing a language they had learned over years. He wrote about the canyon crawlers' sulfuric marker chemistry and what it suggested about their nervous system architecture. He wrote about the soil, the water, the underground connections between the sinkhole network, the atmospheric event and its kill zone, and the recovery pattern afterward, which was faster than standard fauna collapse models, predicted and suggested something about the ecosystem's resilience he had not yet fully characterized. He wrote about what humans were. He did not title this section. He slipped it into the biology and chemistry without fanfare, the way you might slip a stone into a wall where there had been a gap. The observational note that a human child, lacking any technology for the first 7 years and limited technology thereafter, had established functional relationships with 3 major predator species of a category 7 world through a process of, he thought about the right word, through a process of patient, systematic, non-threatening assertion. Had mapped terrain that multiple consolidate survey expeditions had not accessed, had developed an understanding of the planet's biological systems sufficient to design safe approach strategies for subsequent crews. He did not say, and the consolidates category 7 designation is wrong. He did not say, this world is not uninhabitable, it is merely honest, and honesty requires something from you. He did not say, what you need to do is sit still and learn the actual game and stop looking at the sky for something to save you. He let the data say it. 3 days later, Commander Dahl called him back to the meeting room. The legal representative was on the encrypted link again, but the tone was different. Dr. Vath was at the table. "We've reviewed your documentation," Dahl said. Cale waited. "The regional office is classifying you as a provisional xenological consultant for the duration of the survey operation," Dahl said. He said it the way someone reads a thing they didn't write and aren't sure they agree with. "You'll be consulted on decisions related to surface operations. Your observational record will be formally incorporated into the survey database." "Thank you," Cale said. "There are conditions," Dahl said. "The reintegration protocol is still required. The psychological assessment." "I'll submit to the assessment," Cale said. "I want a copy of the results." Dahl blinked. "That's not standard." "It will be for me," Cale said. "I want to know what it says." He submitted to the assessment the following morning with a psychologist from the ship's medical team, a young consolidate officer who approached the session with careful professionalism and ended it with a look on his face that suggested he was going to have to file an unusual report. Cale answered everything directly. He answered the questions about the crash and his parents and the first year with the same flat, factual voice he used for everything, and when the psychologist looked at him with an expression that he recognized as clinical concern, he said, "I'm not going to fall apart. I understand that you're looking for signs that I might. I don't think I'm going to. I think what happened to me was very hard and I have it organized in a way that lets me function. I don't know if that's healthy or if it's something else. I'd be interested to know what the report says." The psychologist wrote for a long time after he left. The survey operation ran for 48 days. He worked alongside Dr. Vath, leading teams into terrain that would have been inaccessible without his knowledge of the fauna patterns and territory boundaries. The first few days were difficult in ways he had not anticipated. The survey crew were professionals, scientists, geologists, two additional xenobiologists who had read Dr. Vath's summary document and arrived with the focused attention of people handed an unexpected research gift. They were not foolish. They followed instructions. But they moved through the world the way people moved who had been told what to expect rather than having learned what to expect, which was a fundamentally different relationship to uncertainty. And the difference showed constantly in small ways that required correction. A geologist named Orrin on day 3 moved toward a rock outcrop in the northeast canyon without checking the shadow angles first. The ridge stalkers used the outcrop as a transitional resting point in the late afternoon, not a den, nothing permanent, but a place where their territorial path paused and they sat, which meant the approaches to it during those hours were effectively staked. Cale moved Orrin back with a hand on his shoulder before anything happened, explaining quietly, and Orrin was professional enough to absorb the explanation without resistance. But the moment reminded Cale of something he had half forgotten, that knowledge was not transferable at the speed of a briefing. It took time for information about a dangerous world to become instinct. He had 10 years of instinct. They had 7 days of briefings. He adjusted his approach. He started working more in pairs, assigning each survey team member a specific behavioral rule rather than a general explanation. Don't approach this rock face from below. Always check the water surface for vibration before entering this channel. If you hear that frequency overhead, stop moving immediately and wait for my signal. Simple, specific, auditable. The kind of instruction that didn't require understanding, only compliance, until understanding had time to develop. It was the approach he had taken with himself in year 1, and it worked, for the same reasons it had worked then. You couldn't give someone 10 years of experience in a week, but you could give them 10 years of conclusions and buy them time to earn the experience. 3 times, his guidance kept survey personnel out of situations that would have resulted in casualties. Once, the canyon crawler encounter on day 22. He did something the survey team reported in 3 separate incident logs as inexplicable, which was approach an agitated canyon crawler in the posture configuration he had developed and hold the animal's attention long enough for the team to extract safely. He did not think of it as inexplicable. He thought of it as knowing the actual game. Dr. Vath wrote about him. He knew she was writing about him because she stopped asking him questions and started asking him permission. He gave it. He read the draft she sent him on day 39 and corrected 3 errors of fact and suggested 2 reframings. She incorporated both. It was, he thought, a reasonable collaboration. On day 46, he stood at the edge of the canyon system he had first navigated in year 1, 2 members of the survey team behind him at a respectful distance, and looked down at the river that had saved him the first week. It was low now, dry season. He could see the far bank where he had pulled himself out. He could see the rock shelf above where he had spent the first winter, the wall of stone he had learned to treat as home. He did not feel sentimental about it exactly. Sentiment was a luxury he had deferred so long it had become something else. Not bitterness, nothing as active as that, but a kind of precise and unsentimental relationship with the past that allowed him to look at it without being pulled in. He had needed to be here. He had made what he needed from what was here. That was the whole of it. This is where you survived the first ridge stalker encounter, one of the survey team said. She was reviewing his documentation on a tablet. The river. Yes, he said. How? She hesitated in the particular way he had noticed all of them hesitating, the moment before the question that they knew was impolite but could not ask. How do you feel about, she gestured at the canyon, at the planet in general, coming back, being here again? This time with people, she meant this time with other people. He thought about this carefully. He thought about the silence on the ship that first night, too soft, too quiet. He thought about the way his voice had sounded when he talked to Dr. Vath, strange to himself. He thought about the marks he had carved and counted and stopped counting. He thought about his father and his mother, and the way the thing that had happened to him at 7 years old had broken something in him that had then, over 10 years of non-stop necessity, grown back in a different shape. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I haven't finished learning what it means." The survey team member nodded like this was a normal answer. He supposed here it was. On the last evening before departure, he went to the ridge where he had first seen the Ridge Stalker pack. The pack was there, or some of them 5 adults and a juvenile he didn't recognize, which meant Case's line had continued. He sat at the boundary of their acknowledgement zone, and they regarded him with the flat-eyed professional indifference that was, in his experience, the highest compliment a Ridge Stalker paid. "You are a thing that is here. I have logged you. I am continuing." He sat with them as the sun set. He did not take notes. He did not scan or observe or catalog. He just sat. When the light was nearly gone, he stood and shifted his weight to his heels and lowered his chin. And the nearest Ridge Stalker held his eyes for 8 seconds, and then did the same. He went back down the hill. Behind him, the pack moved along the ridge in the falling dark, the iron-grinding calls passing between adults and juveniles like a conversation he could follow the shape of even if he could not parse every word. He had learned to hear them the way you learn to hear a language spoken in the next room, enough to know the emotional register, the intent, the general direction of the thing even when the specifics blurred. They were not saying anything about him. That was fine. He had not expected them to. He had never been part of their story. He had been part of their territory, which was different, a thing with presence and acknowledged standing rather than meaning. He did not need to mean anything to them. He had needed for 10 years to mean enough to the world that the world continued to include him. He had done that. He was taking it with him. He had one moment of something that he chose to think of as gratitude, because he did not have a better word, not toward the planet, which was not a thing you thanked, but toward the 10 years of it, toward the specific and brutal curriculum it had run him through without asking, and the degree it had awarded without ceremony. He had not asked for any of it. It had happened to him, the way the bombing happens to a city, and like a city he had stood afterward in the rubble of himself and found, in the gaps and the char, something structural remaining, something you could build from. He thought, "I know what I am." It was not a triumphant thought. It was a quiet one, the kind that arrives not with music but with the particular quality of silence that comes after a very long sustained note finally resolves. He went back down the hill. In the shuttle, Dr. Vath asked if he was all right. "Yes," he said. "Are you ready to go?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Ready implied a state of completion, a moment when the thing behind you was finished enough to be left. He did not think Veldara 9 was ever going to be behind him in that sense. He thought it was going to be the thing that made him, the same way the bombing of a city might make someone not cleanly, not without cost, but thoroughly. He was going to carry the planet inside him the way you carried anything that had shaped the substance of who you were. That was not the same as being ready to leave it. But he was going. He had the data. He had the relationships. He had the classification battle ahead of him, the consolidate systems and its frameworks and its category designations, and the long work of changing what institutions believe about something when the evidence they've been using is incomplete. He had the report from the psychologist, which he had read and found both accurate and insufficient, and which he was going to annotate and contest through whatever process allowed for contesting it. He had Dr. Vath, who had asked his permission before writing about him, which was, he was beginning to understand, the kind of thing that mattered. He had a lot of work ahead. He had survived Veldara 9 by learning its actual game. He was 17 years old, and he had not yet learned the actual game of the world he was going back to. That seemed about right. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." The shuttle rose. Through the viewport the planet pulled back and back, the canyon systems darkening as night came, the vast orange plains, the cloud formations building in the south that would, in 6 days, clear the lowlands of small fauna and reset the ecological accounting the way it always reset, the way it had been resetting before he arrived and would reset after he was gone. It did not need him. It never had. That was the first thing you learned. On a world like that, the world does not need you specifically. It just lets you in, or it doesn't. It had let him in. He watched it until the cloud cover took it, and it became just another orange disk in the long black. One world among the thousands that surrounded him now. The vast and mostly indifferent universe that had, for 10 years and 4 months, declined to be anything other than exactly what it was. He thought, I know more about that place than anyone alive. He thought, I am going to do something with that. He thought, the game is never what they say it is. The planet disappeared behind cloud. The shuttle broke atmosphere. The stars opened ahead, clean and cold and plentiful, and Kale Morrow, who had been left on a death world as a child and had declined, methodically and without heroism, to be killed by it, leaned his head against the viewport glass, and for the first time in 10 years, let his eyes close before he knew what was coming next.